Now, it's the interview I've been waiting for, you've been waiting for. Sir John Redwood joins me now. I've described him as Margaret Thatcher's favourite MP. I think there's somebody behind me, Marco Portillo, who's preparing for a show that objects to me using that. So I should say, John, you're one of her favourite MPs. And what I'd love to know from you is what you think Thatcher might have made of net zero.
Well, as a scientist worried about the environment, she would have taken the scientific advice very seriously, but she would not have adopted policies in Britain which singled us out for particular punishment, but left the world with more CO2 as a result. She would not have been a fan of any policy which banned things in Britain, leading to imports which gave you more CO2 because of the transport to get the goods into Britain. And in the case of gas, of course, doubly damaging, because you import gas in liquefied form, where an awful lot of extra energy is being used to liquefy it and then to convert it back into gas, as well as for the transport. So she would have seen how foolish that policy was. I'm very glad the government has now recognised that we should get out more of our own oil and gas all the time. We need fossil fuels, but I think they also need to review their work on the motor industry, because we're in grave danger of killing our own motor industry. And then a lot of people after 2030 will be queuing up to buy nearly new imported petrol and diesel cars because they're not convinced about the electric versions.
Should they stop this ban from 2030 on the new diesels and petrols, John? Should the government just pause that policy?
Yes. They should pause that policy, as the European Union has done. And the European Union is particularly enthusiastic about net zero policies, as we know, but they see that it's going to kill the German motor industry. But the other thing they need to do urgently, this government, is to suspend the policy of taxing companies from next year if they don't sell enough electric cars and sell too many petrol and diesel cars. It's a crazy disincentive to any manufacturer to come to Britain, and a particular barrier for our industry at a time when it needs support and help. The industry is crying out to lift that. So I would urge the government to do that immediately. We also need to review the whole nexus of extra taxes on business. It's not just the big increase in corporation tax, but it's the extra penalties on drug suppliers to the NHS. It's the windfall taxes on oil and gas, which were imposed when oil and gas prices were hugely higher than they are today. But they didn't, of course, define a windfall properly. And so they're still charging the same windfall tax, even though the prices have come down a long way again. In
your mind, what should corporation tax be set at?
12.5%, along with the Irish. I think the Irish have got this right. I mean, as I've been explaining to the government for several years, the Irish collect 4 times as much tax per head from business tax than we do, by setting a rate which is now half our level. And we've watched as Ireland has attracted massive American investment, particularly in the digital industries, the really exciting growth area of the world economy. And much of that investment would probably come to Britain if we'd had the same corporation tax rate as the Republic of Ireland.
Yes. As a staunch Brexiteer, are you as frustrated as other people who voted for leave in 2016 that the government hasn't done enough to maximise some of our post-Brexit opportunities?
Well, indeed. I and like-minded MPs are constantly bombarding the government with idea after idea of how we can take advantage of these great freedoms. But there's been a marked reluctance, particularly at the Treasury. So let's take the case of VAT. There was a tax imposed by the European Union and some of its revenues taken by the European Union, ripe for reform. But we still haven't permanently abolished VAT on all green products, for example, which you'd have thought was a no-brainer. We haven't raised the VAT threshold for small business. And your previous guest was reinforcing your point that it's very difficult setting up and growing a small business in Britain, more than it should be. And one of the big barriers is that as soon as you hit 85,000 of turnover, you then have to register for VAT and put your prices up by 20%. Well, that's too soon. Why not raise the threshold to 250,000? We'd immediately get a growth in capacity and activity, because there are a lot of businesses that stop trading when they get to the 85,000.
When you make this point to the Chancellor, does he listen?
Well, yes, he's always very polite and he always listens, but he obviously doesn't agree.
He listens and ignores.
The Treasury orthodoxy defends every bit of VAT they've got at the moment. And of course, it was the Treasury orthodoxy which, for example, gave George Osborne the idea of increasing VAT on things that people just thought were outrageous. And that blew up in his face. Now, there has to be a remodelling of VAT, and we need taxes that make sense for Britain to promote more growth. Because as Roger Bootle was rightly saying, if you get more growth, the deficit will come down faster than if you go for the recessionary model.
Yes.
The Bank of England has behaved extremely badly in the last 3 or 4 years because its model doesn't work. It now accepts that its model doesn't work.
Yes.
Its forecasts have been wildly inaccurate, both on inflation and on growth. And yet they're still making these regular calls about hiking interest rates up when they know their forecasts don't work. And in these latest August forecasts, they tell us there is a 90% probability that unemployment in 3 years' time will be somewhere between 2% and 8%. Well, yes, I agree with that, but that's highs and lows for the decade.
So, John, I think we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid.
A very different policy if unemployment was about to halve to 2%.
OK, John.
Than the policy you would follow if it's about to double.
John Redwood, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning.